Hello, welcome to Biology with Risa. In this video, we will be looking at part 2 of the respiratory system, and we'll be looking at respiratory physiology. Now let's look at the different types of breathing. The type of breathing that you're doing right now while you're sitting there watching this video is called quiet breathing or eupnea. This suffix means breathing or respiration, nia. Eu means good or true. So you're doing something called good breathing right now. The type of breathing that you do when you're doing quiet breathing is relaxed, it's unconscious, and it's automatic. So this is a type of breathing you typically do when you are at rest. When you're doing quiet breathing, muscles are required for inhalation to breathe in. However, exhalation or breathing out is a passive process and does not require any muscles. However, if you were doing something called forced breathing or hyperpnea, well, this would require a lot more work. Remember, the suffix means breathing or respiration. Hyper means greater or more or excessive. So here you're doing excessive breathing. When you're undergoing forced breathing, you're actively manipulating your breathing in such a way that you increase the depth of each breath and also the rate of breathing. This typically occurs when you are exercising or maybe when you are singing. In order to do forced breathing, you have to use accessory muscles for both inhalation and exhalation because you're forcing more air in and you're forcing more air out than would normally occur. Another type of breathing is called apnea. A means without. So this means without breathing. So this is whenever somebody undergoes temporary cessation of breathing. So they might skip a breath every once in a while when they're breathing. This typically happens when certain people are sleeping. Sleep apnea is actually rather common, especially in people that are overweight. And the last type of breathing that we're going to look at is called dyspnea, or you could think of this as shortness of breath. This prefix dys means like difficulty. So it means you have difficulty breathing. So this is usually characterized by very difficult and labored breathing. The individual sometimes is even gasping for air because it's really hard for them to inhale and maybe even exhale. The most common causes of dyspnea include asthma, suffering from heart failure, or maybe suffering for something called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD. COPD is like an umbrella term for pretty much a bunch of different lung diseases that make it difficult to breathe. Pneumonia can also cause dyspnea, and things like anxiety can make it very difficult for you to breathe and make breathing very labored. One way that doctors can get an idea of somebody's lung health or respiratory health is through a process called spirometry. And this is a process that measures pulmonary ventilation. And there's a lot of different types of spirometers, and 3 common types of spirometers are pictured here. So what types of respiratory volumes can you measure? Well, one thing is the tidal volume. So this is the amount of air that normally enters the lung during quiet breathing. So right now, when you're sitting here just doing quiet breathing, breathing in and out, you're usually breathing in and out about 500 milliliters of air each time. However, you're not breathing in or breathing out the maximum capacity of air that you could. So the expiratory reserve volume is the amount of extra air you could forcibly exhale past a normal tidal expiration. So again, just take a normal breath in, take a normal breath out. Now pause and then push out any extra air that you have. That extra air that you were able to push out is your expiratory reserve volume. It's the extra air past a normal exhalation. Same thing can happen with inspiration. And so when you're breathing in normally, you're not breathing in the maximum amount that you could. So the extra volume that can be forcibly brought into the lungs past your tidal inspiration is called your inspiratory reserve volume. So in order to observe this, take a normal breath in and then breathe in the extra bit of air that you could. So we're not always breathing in our maximum amount of air, okay? So the extra little bit that you could be breathing in is your inspiratory reserve volume. And then one other thing I want to point out though is that even after you exhale as much as you can, so breathe out as much as you can right now. Even though I think I breathed out all the air possible, it's not possible to breathe out all the air in your lungs. There's always a little bit of residual air left in your lungs. And this residual air is just simply called your residual volume. So this is the air that's left over even if you forcibly exhale as much as you can. And the benefit of this is that it prevents the alveoli or the air sacs in your lungs from completely collapsing. So you always have a little bit of air in your lungs even when you try to force as much of it out. So if you want to figure out what your total lung capacity is, you would just add up all these numbers. You would add up the amount that you normally breathe in and out, the tidal volume, plus the maximum amount that you could breathe out, or the extra amount you could breathe out, which would be the expiratory reserve volume, plus the extra bit you could breathe in, and also what's left in your lungs. Add all these up, that gives you your total lung capacity. One thing that you measured in our lab was vital capacity. And this is a total amount of air that can be forcibly inhaled and then exhaled with maximum effort. But it does not include the residual volume because even when you breathe out as much as you can, remember that residual volume is still left in your lungs. So the average vital capacity for a person is usually between 4,000 and 5,000 milliliters. But again, this is going to vary depending on whether you're male or female, based on your size, also based on maybe how athletic you are, whether you play a wind instrument or not. And you can actually increase your vital capacity by doing certain types of training. The vital capacity, therefore, is equal to the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume, but it does not include that residual volume that's left within your lungs. This is a graph representing these different respiratory volumes. So this is showing your total lung capacity here. This is showing your tidal volume. This is a normal breath in and out. But remember, you can take extra air in. That's my inspiratory reserve volume. I can also breathe extra air out from what I normally do. That's my expiratory reserve volume. You can see here that the vital capacity is that maximum I can breathe in and the maximum I can breathe out. So if I add this inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume, that gives you my vital capacity. And then the residual volume, you can't really change that because that's just kind of what's left inside your lungs. All right, with knowing that, let's see if you can match these respiratory volumes with the correct letter. So what would A be? A would be your inspiratory reserve volume, the extra air you can breathe in. B would be your tidal volume, the normal amount that you're breathing. C would be your expiratory reserve volume, the extra amount that you can breathe out. D would be your residual volume, what's left in your lungs even when you maximally exhale. E, so E is representing some type of volume that it includes everything but the residual volume. That would be your vital capacity. And then F would be your total lung capacity. Another common respiratory volume measurement is minute respiratory volume. And this is very similar to cardiac output. If you remember, when we talked about cardiac output, that is the maximum amount of blood that can be pumped out of the heart per minute. Minute respiratory volume is the amount of air that can be inhaled or exhaled per minute. And this is a very important parameter in respiratory medicine due to its relationship with blood carbon dioxide levels. Because the more carbon dioxide in your blood, the more acidic your blood becomes. And this means that if your minute respiratory volume is really low, that could indicate that you're going to have higher carbon dioxide levels in your blood. So how do we calculate the minute respiratory volume? Well, it's simply the amount of air inhaled per breath times your respiratory rate. So how many breaths you're taking per minute. So you don't have to memorize these numbers, but let's just see how we can apply this. At rest, your minute respiratory volume would equal 500 milliliters, which is the amount that you typically breathe in, times 12 breaths per minute, which is your resting breathing rate. And you multiply those together, that means that you typically per minute breathe about 6,000 milliliters of air into your lungs per minute. This is, just the kind of the normal amount that you're breathing when you're just relaxed. During heavy exercise, your minute respiratory volume can be as high as 125 to 170 liters of air per minute. And during strenuous exercise in young adults, they can breathe about 35 to 45 times each minute. And then if you're an elite athlete, you may take up to 60 to 70 breaths each minute. So you can see how we can really increase our minute respiratory volumes in times of need. Now let's talk about what actually allows you to breathe. Breathing requires two factors to work. First, the contraction and relaxation of muscle fibers of both the diaphragm and thorax. The diaphragm is a sheet of skeletal muscle below the lungs. And the thoracic muscles that we're talking about here are the external intercostal muscles. And these are actually muscles between your ribs. Now, one thing I want to point out about this muscular activity involved in breathing is that it's partly voluntary, meaning that you can control it if you want to, but it's mainly involuntary. It's not something that you have to think about. And this is kind of unique to most skeletal muscles because skeletal muscles we typically think of as being voluntary only. But the skeletal muscles involved in breathing can be both involuntary and voluntary. The second factor that is necessary for breathing to work is a difference in pressure between the air in the atmosphere out here and the air in the lungs. And it's the difference in that pressure that drives air to either enter your lungs or to leave your lungs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides from now. Let's talk a little bit more about these muscles that are involved in breathing. These muscles are extremely important because the lung tissue itself does not contain any muscles. So the lung tissue itself passively expands and recoils during breathing. So the lungs, if you remember, they have two layers surrounding them, and the lungs are pretty much attached to your thoracic wall. So as your thoracic wall expands, the lungs kind of just expand with it. And then your lungs just naturally will recoil back in too. So the lungs themselves aren't doing any of the work with breathing. It has to all do with these primary muscles outside of the lungs that are helping to change the volume in your thoracic cavity. So the two principal muscles of respiration, again, are your diaphragm, which is a sheet of skeletal muscle inferior to the lungs. And then we have the intercostal muscles. These are skeletal muscles between the ribs. The diaphragm and the intercostal muscles are the only muscles that are involved when you're just doing quiet breathing, just breathing in and out, relaxed. Now, whenever you're doing forced breathing, like during exercise or something like that, there are also accessory muscles in your back, your chest, and your abdomen that help you bring in that extra air and forcibly exhale that extra air. So one thing that you definitely want to know is whether the muscles, the primary muscles, meaning the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, whether they are contracting or relaxing to allow you to breathe in or out. So the way I like to think about this is, first off, you have to remember that when a muscle contracts, it gets shorter. And so if you think about the diaphragm, when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's kind of curved up like you see here. And you can see it's a lot longer here. So this is a relaxed diaphragm. When the diaphragm is relaxed, there's less volume in the lungs here. So when the diaphragm relaxes, the volume in your lungs goes down and air goes out. You expire, you breathe out. Okay, so when the muscle relaxes, you exhale. When the muscle contracts, as you can see here, the muscle shortens. So this is contraction. The diaphragm is flattening out. And when it does that, you can see that the volume in the lungs increases. And so now there's more space in here, the air can enter and go into that. So you could think about this by visually thinking about it like that. Another way you could think about it is just thinking about how you feel. Okay, so muscle contraction equals inhalation, muscle relaxation equals exhalation. Okay, so again, now if you think about this, when you relax your body, I want everybody to take a nice sigh out. When you sigh, your body's relaxed, your muscles are also relaxed, and you're exhaling. So I always just think about when I breathe out, it's a very relaxed process. And so my muscles are also relaxing. But breathing in takes a lot more work, and my breathing muscles are contracting to bring that air in. Okay? So however you want to think about it, that's fine. Really what you just have to memorize is this right here. Okay? What's happening here? What's happened to the volume in the lungs when that happens? So how does the volume in your lungs change when your diaphragm contracts while your diaphragm flattens out and the volume in your lungs increases? How does the volume in your lungs change when the diaphragm relaxes? When the diaphragm relaxes, it curves upwards. So the volume in your lungs decreases, okay, and air goes out. Now, the second factor that I said was really important in breathing is pressure relationships. Specifically, the relationship between the pressure in the atmosphere and the pressure in your lungs. So before we can really talk more about that, let's talk about what exactly is pressure and how it is affected by changes in volume. Pressure is a force created by the collision of gas molecules on the surfaces they come in contact with. So the more collisions of these gas molecules on the surfaces around them, the greater the pressure. And you can think about how this relates to volume by looking at something called Boyle's law. Boyle's law states that the pressure of a gas is inversely related to its volume, given that the temperature and the number of gas molecules is constant, and we haven't changed that. Okay, and you can see that illustrated here. So both of these containers contain the same amount of gas molecules. However, if I increase the volume, so I pull this piston up, what's happening now is that the volume has increased, the gas molecules have more space to move, and they collide with the surfaces less. So the pressure decreases. As volume increases, pressure decreases. Well, what happens if I push the piston down? If I push it down, now these gas molecules are more dense and they're going to collide with the surfaces more frequently, and pressure increases. So as the volume decreases, pressure increases. If you would like to watch a little video about this, I'll put a link for that in the description below. So, little recall activity here. Which container contains a greater pressure of gas? The answer would be B. Again, because we have a smaller volume, so the gas molecules are colliding more with the surface. Now that you can define pressure and you understand how volume affects pressure, let's look at the 3 important types of pressure that are associated with breathing or ventilation. The first is the atmospheric pressure. This is the air pressure exerted on the body, so it's the air pressure that surrounds you. Second is the intrapulmonary pressure, also known as the intraalveolar pressure. This is the air pressure actually within your lungs, specifically within the alveoli or the little sacs, little air sacs within your lungs. The third really important pressure involved in breathing is called the intrapleural pressure. And this is the pressure within the pleural cavity. So remember that your lungs are surrounded, each lung is surrounded by a double membrane. The membrane that's actually touching the lungs here is called the visceral pleura. And viscera means organ, so it's actually the one that's in contact with the lungs. But you also have an outer membrane here called the parietal pleura. And the parietal pleura is attached to your thoracic wall. The negative pressure in this pleural cavity, which is a little bit of fluid between both layers, actually helps to adhere the parietal and visceral pleural members together. So this pressure must stay negative, and it's always negative. It's kind of like a little vacuum between the parietal and visceral pleura. If for some reason air gets into that space or something, it can actually cause these two layers, the visceral and parietal pleura, to separate, and it would cause your lungs to completely collapse. We'll talk about that more later. Another thing that's really important is whether air actually enters or leaves the lungs is dependent on the difference between the atmospheric pressure out here and the intrapulmonary pressure. Okay, so the difference in atmospheric pressure and intrapulmonary pressure are going to determine whether air leaves or enters the lungs. And the pressure within this intrapleural space here is pretty much just to keep the lungs functioning properly and keeping those membranes, attached together on the outside. So why is the pressure relationship between the atmosphere and the lungs important in breathing? This is because the difference in pressure drives pulmonary ventilation, because air always flows down its concentration gradient. This means that air flows from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. And this is what's going to drive inhalation and exhalation. So one thing to remember is that when you're breathing, the pressure in the atmosphere remains constant. That makes sense. We're not going to be having any effect on the air around us, really. But what is changing is the pressure in our lungs. So at rest, so in between breaths, like in between breathing out and breathing in, like you pause for a second. So when you're at rest, there's no net movement of gas molecules. And that's because the pressure in the atmosphere and in the lungs is equal. However, whenever you inhale, when you breathe in, remember your diaphragm is contracting. What's happening to the volume in your lungs? It's increasing. So what's happening to the pressure? Remember, if volume increases, pressure decreases. Okay, so now the pressure has gone down inside your lungs. And since the pressure has gone down in your lungs, what's happening here is now the atmospheric pressure is greater than the pressure in your lungs, so air will flow into your lungs. Now, what about when you're exhaling? When you exhale, what happens to the volume in your lungs? Well, when you exhale, your diaphragm relaxes, the volume in your lungs decreases. So if the volume decreases, what happens to the pressure? They're inverse, so the pressure would increase. So now, because the pressure has increased, the pressure in my lungs is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere, so the air gets pushed out. Let's talk a little bit about how pressure associated with breathing is measured and expressed. So atmospheric pressure is measured in what we call atmospheric units or millimeters of mercury. At sea level, the atmospheric pressure is equal to 1 atmospheric unit or 760 millimeters of mercury. And the way that we've calculated that is you get like some type of like tube and you put it into a container of mercury. the atmospheric pressure pushes down on that, and it would actually cause the mercury level in the tube to rise up 760 millimeters. And so that's how we can actually measure the amount of pressure from the air being pushed down. One thing I want to point out now, and I'm going to talk about again later on in this PowerPoint, is that atmospheric pressure decreases at higher elevations. So when you go up and you climb a mountain, there's going to be, the atmospheric pressure is going to be less than 760. And that's because there's less gas molecules higher up. Okay, so the gas molecules become less dense, so there's less gas molecules hitting the surface of the mercury, causing this to go up less. Another thing I want to point out about atmospheric pressures is that all pressures associated with breathing or respiration are expressed in relationship to the atmospheric pressure, because we know the atmospheric pressure doesn't change as you're breathing. Okay, so any negative pressure would be a pressure that's lower than the atmospheric pressure. Positive pressures are pressures greater than the atmospheric pressure. And pressures that are equal to the atmospheric pressure would be expressed as 0 because they are the same as the atmospheric pressure. Okay, so when you're breathing again, I said that the pressures associated with breathing are always expressed in relationship to the atmospheric pressure. So let's just see what kind of this means. So here I have 4 containers, and it tells you what the absolute pressure is in each container. And I want to see, are you capable of expressing this in relationship to the atmospheric pressure at sea level, which would be 760 millimeters of mercury. So for example, here, the pressure in this container is 756 millimeters of mercury. Well, that's 4 below the atmospheric pressure, so we would just express this as -4. So this would be considered a negative pressure compared to the atmospheric pressure. What about this one? How would I express the pressure in this container? Since it's 1 above, I would say +1. This one, it's 1 below, so I would just say -1. This one would be expressed as 0. This is important because a lot of times when they talk about breathing, they'll say like the intrapulmonary pressure is +3 or +1. And so that's talking about it in relationship to the atmospheric pressure. So now that you understand how pressure is typically expressed, let's summarize the effects that breathing has on the different pressures that we've talked about already. So atmospheric pressure does not change during breathing, so it's always going to be expressed as 0, okay, because that's kind of our baseline. Intrapulmonary pressure, so the pressure within your lungs, at rest, the pressure in your lungs is equal to the atmospheric pressure, so it would be 0. However, during inspiration, remember the volume in my lungs increases, so the pressure decreases and it becomes negative compared to the atmospheric pressure. During expiration, when I breathe out, the pressure in my lungs increases because the volume has decreased, and that pressure in my lungs becomes positive compared to the atmospheric pressure. All right, so atmospheric pressure does not change. It is always 0. Intrapulmonary pressure becomes more negative during inspiration. It becomes more positive during expiration. The other type of pressure that we talked about that's really important in breathing is the intrapleural pressure. So remember, this is the pressure within the pleural cavity. One thing I want you to remember about this is that it's always negative and it's always lower than the intrapulmonary and atmospheric pressure. Okay, it will always be negative during all phases of breathing. This is important because the constant negative intrapleural pressure, along with the surface tension created by the pleural fluid itself, both of those work together to help keep the pleural membrane sticking together during expansion of the lungs, and it prevents your lungs from collapsing. Okay, so it's holding the 2 pleural membranes together and preventing them from separating. So here we can actually see some examples of pressure changes during breathing. So here the person is at rest. So you can see the atmospheric and intrapulmonary pressure are equal, and the intrapleural pressure is always less than the other 2. So it would be -4 in this case. During inspiration, the volume in the lungs is increasing. What's happening to the pressure in the lungs? It's going down. So atmospheric pressure is 0, intrapulmonary pressure is -2. The intrapleural pressure went down a little bit. However, remember, the only thing I really want you to know about that is that it's still more negative than the other two. When you breathe out, volumes in your lungs decrease. That causes the pressure to increase above the atmospheric pressure. So now it's +3, and that causes air to go out. The intrapleural pressure goes back to -4, but again, it's still negative. It always is negative, and it's always less than the atmospheric pressure and intrapulmonary pressure. If you want to watch an animation of these pressure changes during breathing, I will put a link below. Now I want to emphasize again the importance of this negative intrapleural pressure. Negative intrapleural pressure keeps the lungs inflated and prevents them from collapsing. This is extremely important. It creates a partial vacuum, causing the visceral pleura here, also shown here, and parietal pleura here. It keeps them sticking together. And this is important because think about it. Your lungs, right here, are actually very elastic. So like a rubber band, when they stretch, if you let go of them, they want to recoil and go back and collapse. However, when my chest wall expands, my chest, just think when I'm breathing in, my chest wall is expanding. My lungs want to recoil, go the other way. By having this negative pressure in the pleural cavity, it actually keeps the chest wall and the lungs together and keeps them from separating. However, there are cases where the intrapleural pressure doesn't stay negative and the lungs actually collapse. A collapsed lung is called a pneumothorax, and this can occur when air enters the usually airtight intrapleural space or pleural cavity. And this can occur because of trauma, such as from gunshot, fractured rib, or a knife wound. Also, certain types of lung disease can actually result in air entering this intrapleural space. And so if air for some reason enters the intrapleural space or pleural cavity here, what's going to happen then is that instead of the pressure here being negative, it's going to equal the pressure in the outside here, the atmospheric pressure. And because we lost the vacuum, the lungs actually collapses on itself. And the lung and the chest wall are no longer held together. And so that can be really problematic. If something like that happens, you would have to remove the excess air out here to allow the lungs to inflate again. This is a very important diagram that you want to know because it summarizes the muscle activity and pressure relationships that drive breathing. So why do we inhale? We inhale because our diaphragm contracts and moves down. In addition, our rib muscles contract, or in other words, our intercostal muscles contract, and our rib cage expands. Both of these working together causes the volume of our lungs to increase. That causes the pressure in our lungs to decrease. So now the air pressure is higher in the atmosphere than in our lungs. Air enters. Why do we breathe out? Why do we exhale? Well, our diaphragm relaxes, it moves up. Our rib muscles also relax. This decreases the volume in our lungs. When the volume in our lungs decreases, the pressure increases. So now the air pressure in the atmosphere is lower than the air pressure in our lungs, so the air goes out. Now let's do some recall exercises to see if you understand the concepts we just covered. The figure at the right represents a model of the human respiratory system. If you look here, we can see these balloons. They're representing the lungs, and they're connected to the outside by this tube so air can enter or leave the lungs. This space out here in the chamber, it represents the chest cavity. And this is a membrane down here that can be pulled down or pushed up, and this is representing the diaphragm. If the diaphragm were pulled down, which of the following would be true? So pause the video, read through the options, and pick which one you think is true, and I will go over the answer. The correct answer is A. The pressure in the chamber would go down and the balloons would fill with air. This occurs because if I pull the diaphragm down, so let's imagine that I'm pulling it down like this. Now I've increased the volume in the chest cavity. And if I increase the volume, what happened to the pressure? If you increase the volume, the pressure goes down. So the pressure is lower here. I've decreased the pressure. And since the pressure is lower here, gases always move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. So since I've decreased the pressure inside the chest cavity, air enters and it would go into the lungs or the balloons. All right, for each statement below, circle the correct answer. When the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract, this causes you to... So I think about the diaphragm, when it contracts, it flattens. So that would cause me to inhale. It would increase the volume in my lungs. The intrapleural pressure is always greater or less than the intrapulmonary and atmospheric pressure. Remember, intrapleural pressure is always negative, so it's always less than both intrapulmonary and atmospheric pressure. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes. Just exhale and you'll remember, I feel relaxed. When I exhale, what happens to the volume in the lungs? Well, it's going to decrease. And the intrapulmonary pressure becomes, if the volume's decreasing, the intrapulmonary pressure becomes positive, pushes the air out. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts, because that's a lot more work. The volume in the lungs increases, and the intrapulmonary pressure becomes increasing the volume. Pressure goes down, so it's going to become negative. If the intrapulmonary pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure, then air will enter or exit the lungs. If the intrapulmonary pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure, well, I know pressure always goes from an area where there's more pressure to where there's less pressure, so air must enter my lungs. That's the correct answer. When the diaphragm relaxes, the pressure in the lungs increases or decreases. So when my diaphragm relaxes, so I'm going to think about this. Diaphragm relaxes, it's going to fold up. So if the diaphragm relaxing, what's happening to the volume in my lungs? It's going down. So the pressure must be going up. So it must increase. See how I think about it? Like, I don't memorize these answers. I kind of have to visualize what's happening in my body. And that's what I want you to do, okay? Take it step by step. Think about what's happening. What happens if the intrapleural pressure increases to equal the atmospheric pressure? Well, we know intrapleural pressure always should be negative. And so if it equals the atmospheric pressure, that's going to be a problem, because now the lungs is going to collapse, because now the lungs can't be vacuumed to the chest wall anymore. One thing I want to briefly mention is the effect that temperature can have on the volume and pressure of a gas. So what exactly is temperature? Temperature is the measurement of the kinetic energy of molecules, so how much they're moving. And when you increase temperature, you're always going to increase the movement of the molecules. And so what this means is that when you increase temperature, the molecules are going to be moving a lot more, the gas molecules. And since they're moving faster, they're going to collide more and spread out more. And so the volume of the gas would increase as the temperature increases. So why is this important to breathing? Well, think about it. We normally inhale about 500 milliliters of air. However, on a cold day, such as in the winter, we actually take shorter breaths of air, because what happens is that the air outside of our body is cold. When we inhale the air, it gets warmed up, and it actually will expand when we breathe it in. So, for example, in the winter, you may breathe in 420 milliliters of air, but it will expand to 500 milliliters once it's warmed by your airways. However, on a warm day, we tend to take longer breaths to fill our lungs because the air doesn't expand as much. So temperature outside can also affect kind of how you're breathing and how much air you have to take into your lungs to fill them. Now let's talk about factors that may make it harder for somebody to breathe. Forces that slow the movement of gases through the lungs create pulmonary resistance. And the greater the resistance, the slower the airflow. This is similar to when we talked about resistance in blood vessels. When there's a lot of resistance in your blood vessels, it prevents blood flow. When there's a lot of resistance in your lungs, it prevents airflow. There are two factors that influence airway resistance. The first is the size of your airways. For example, changes in bronchial diameter can affect how easily air enters and leaves your lungs. Bronchoconstriction, whenever the bronchioles get narrower, this increases resistance and decreases airflow. When you have bronchodilation and the bronchioles get a larger diameter, that would lower resistance because it lowers the amount of friction, right? Air can flow easier in that way. The second factor that can influence airway resistance is pulmonary compliance. And don't be scared by this word compliance. We use the word compliant a lot to describe people. So let's look up what compliant means in dictionary.com. It means if somebody is very compliant, they are obeying, obliging, or yielding, especially in a submissive way. They pretty much will do whatever you tell them to do. So if we're saying that if we're talking about a compliant lung, then that lung pretty much does what it's supposed to do easily, okay? So pulmonary compliance is the ability of the lungs to expand easily when it should. Okay, so think about this, like a thick balloon has very low compliance because if you're trying to blow up a really thick balloon, it's really hard and it doesn't really want to obey you very well. But the thing about the lungs that I want to point out is that having too high compliance or too low compliance can cause problems with airflow. Just like a person, right? A person that's too compliant is going to be taken advantage of, but a person that's not compliant enough, they're just difficult to work with, okay? So think about the lungs in that way. It's got to be just the right amount of compliance. What are some factors that can affect bronchial diameter? Well, there are things that can constrict your bronchioles. For example, anaphylactic shock, being exposed to allergens in your blood, right? Or asthma. These are two common things that can affect the diameter of your bronchioles. And what happens during an asthmatic attack or during anaphylactic shock is your bronchioles constrict. And that's because your parasympathetic nerves are stimulated. And so this closes your airways. And in the case of asthma, not only do the airways become closed, they start to fill with fluid. And that's really going to increase pulmonary resistance and make it hard to breathe. One way, though, that you can kind of counteract this is by using an inhaler. An inhaler contains medication that dilates the bronchioles. It contains epinephrine, and that stimulates your sympathetic nerves, and that causes dilation of your bronchioles and opens them up again to increase airflow. Now let's talk about some factors that affect pulmonary compliance. Remember, too much or too little pulmonary compliance can be a problem. So let's talk about some factors that may decrease compliance. So these prevent the lungs from expanding easily or make it difficult for you to expand your lungs. One thing would be insufficient pulmonary surfactant. So remember, there are special cells within your alveoli. These cells will actually secrete a fluid called pulmonary surfactant. Pulmonary surfactant decreases the surface tension within your alveoli, so it prevents your alveoli from clinging together and collapsing. Okay. However, insufficient pulmonary surfactant causes the alveoli to collapse and cling together and makes it more difficult for them to expand. This is actually very, very common in premature babies because they are born without the ability to really make their own pulmonary surfactant. Another thing that can prevent the lungs from expanding easily is if the lungs are too stiff. And this tends to occur when there's a lot of scarring in the lungs, or in other words, it's called fibrosis, when there's a lot of scarring. All this scar tissue makes the lungs very stiff and makes it very difficult for the lungs to expand, and makes it really difficult for them to recoil. Pretty much they just become stuck. So here you can see normal compliance, so the amount of pressure needed to get the lungs to fill. If there's fibrosis occurring, there's very low compliance. You have to put in a lot of pressure into your lungs for it to expand, and it's not even going to expand to the normal volume. Now let's talk about a factor that increases compliance. So now you could think of it as the lungs are listening a little bit too much, okay? So the lungs expand really easily, but they have a difficult time recoiling. One thing that would cause this to happen is if a lung has low elasticity. So when I think about the word elasticity, I always think of a rubber band, right? A rubber band can be stretched, but then it recoils really easily after being stretched. If a rubber band loses its elasticity, it'll be stretched, but then it gets all weird and it doesn't really recoil back. Okay, so a lung with low elasticity will fill with air easily, but has a difficult time recoiling or emptying the air. An example of a condition that would cause low elasticity of your lungs would be emphysema. Emphysema is a condition where the walls of the alveoli are destroyed, and so then you have larger air sacs in your lungs, and this lowers the lung's ability to recoil. So somebody who's suffering from emphysema, their lungs will expand really easily. They'll fill with air really easily, but they may have a more difficult time actually exhaling, getting that air out, because the lungs, after it fills, it has a difficult time actually recoiling and going back down. In summary, factors that decrease compliance prevent the lungs from expanding easily. This includes insufficient pulmonary surfactant, makes your alveoli too clingy, and also having really stiff lungs. That's going to decrease compliance. Factors that increase compliance are ones that lower the elasticity, so the lungs don't recoil very easily. They just expand really easily. Now let's talk about some common pulmonary ventilation disorders. Many disorders lower pulmonary compliance and interfere with airflow by narrowing or blocking the airway, damaging the lung tissue, or increasing fluid in the lungs. These things often result in difficulty in breathing and may result in bluish discoloration of the skin called cyanosis if the person is not getting enough oxygen. The disorders that you should know include asthma, pulmonary fibrosis, emphysema, and pneumonia. These are the four that we're just going to briefly go over. One term I would just like to mention is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. This is an umbrella term used to describe progressive lung diseases, including emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and irreversible forms of asthma. COPD is characterized by a very difficult time breathing. And the crazy thing about it is that it's usually preventable. It's usually caused by smoking or exposure to air pollutants. And the amount of money that goes into trying to treat people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is just extremely high. And the sad thing is that most of the time it could be prevented in the first place. The first disorder that we're going to look at is asthma. Asthma is a chronic disease characterized by three things. 1, inflammation of the airway. 2, bronchoconstriction of the airway. And 3, excess mucus in the airway, all of which limit airflow to the lungs. We're not exactly sure why some people develop asthma and not other people, Well, one thing that we think may cause asthma to occur is an overreactive immune system, because studies have shown that people that are suffering from asthma tend to have a higher eosinophil activity within their airways. Certain things can trigger asthma to worsen, such as irritants in the air, like dust, pollen, pet dander, or smoke. Exercise can also sometimes increase the symptoms of asthma, as well as stress. The second disorder that I would like you to know is pulmonary fibrosis. This is scarring of the lungs, and the cause of it is usually unknown. So here would be the normal alveoli. They have a very thin wall to them, whereas somebody suffering from fibrosis would have thickening of their alveolar walls, and it would become very stiff. So this lowers both compliance and elasticity of the lungs. The lungs can't expand easily, and they have a very difficult time recoiling. The third disorder we're going to look at is emphysema. Emphysema is a condition caused by damage to the walls of the alveoli and enlargement of the air spaces. So here's two images showing that. So here's the normal alveoli. There's many little sacs. However, if some of the walls become damaged, it enlarges the sacs of air. Here again, you see small alveoli, but some of the walls are damaged and somebody with emphysema, and now you just have these larger air spaces. Well, this is going to be problematic. Having larger air spaces decreases the surface area for gas exchange and in addition, makes the lungs less elastic and more compliant than they should be. So because you have less walls here, when the lungs expand, they don't recoil very easily. So somebody with emphysema, it's usually easy for them to inhale, but then it's very difficult for them to let out that air. There's a lot of different causes of emphysema, but most of the time it's preventable. Usually it's caused by smoking, air pollution, or chemical fumes. The last disorder that we're going to look at is pneumonia. Pneumonia is actually a respiratory infection. It's usually the result of bacterial, viral, or fungal infections. What this causes is your body to have an immense immune response, and the alveoli will actually start to fill with fluid. And when the alveoli begin to fill with fluid, it becomes really difficult to breathe because gases diffuse through fluid slower than they diffuse through air. And so this pretty much kind of thickens the respiratory membrane and makes it really difficult for gas exchange. All right, let's see if you understand these terms that are associated with pulmonary resistance. So match the term with the correct description. The ability of an object to resume its shape after being stretched. So after it's stretched, its ability to regain its shape, that would be elasticity. The lung's ability to stretch, expand, and fill with air. That would be compliance. The lung is very compliant. It's going to listen and obey. The narrowing of the bronchioles. That would be bronchoconstriction. And the attractive forces of molecules in a liquid. That would be surface tension. Okay, so if you have a lot of surface tension, then you have the molecules are clinging together really easily. Sometimes surface tension is good. You want a lot of surface tension in the pleural cavity so that the membranes stick together. You do not want a lot of surface tension in the alveoli because you do not want the walls of the air sacs to cling together. All right, let's circle the correct answer here. I think all of these say increase or decrease to complete each statement. Bronchoconstriction would blank the resistance to airflow in the lungs. Bronchoconstriction would increase the resistance of airflow in the lungs. Pulmonary surfactant does what to the surface tension in the lungs and what to the compliance? Well, pulmonary surfactant is a good thing, and it's found in the alveoli, so it's going to decrease the surface tension in the alveoli, and it's going to increase the compliance because it's going to prevent the alveoli from clinging together. It's going to allow them to expand easily with air. A lack of pulmonary surfactant in the alveoli would So a lack of pulmonary surfactant. So if I don't have enough pulmonary surfactant in my alveoli, it's going to decrease compliance because you need it for the lungs to expand easily. And what would a lack of pulmonary surfactant do to the airflow in the lungs? It would decrease it. Increasing the elasticity of the lungs would blank the ability of the lungs to recoil. So if you increase the elasticity of something, well, it's going to recoil easier. So it would increase the ability of the lungs to recoil. Emphysema does what to the compliance of the lungs? Emphysema, we said, makes the lungs too compliant. So it's going to increase the compliance of the lungs. They'll fill too easily. Emphysema decreases the elasticity of the lungs. So emphysema, again, makes the lungs expand really easily, but it decreases their ability to recoil. Fibrosis, scarring of the lungs. Well, fibrosis makes your lungs very, very stiff. So they're not going to really move. So it's going to decrease compliance, and it's going to decrease the elasticity. It's not going to let it really expand or recoil. Pneumonia causes fluid to blank in the alveoli, making it more difficult for gas exchange to occur, while pneumonia should increase the amount of fluid, making it harder to breathe. In this next section, we're going to talk about how we can control and regulate our respiratory rate. Now remember, your respiratory rate is the number of breaths per minute, and this is under neural control. You actually have some conscious control over this, and when you consciously control your respiratory rate or how often you breathe, you're using the motor cortex of your cerebrum. But in most cases, this is under autonomic or unconscious control, and it's being controlled by your brainstem. Specifically, the medulla oblongata is setting the basic rhythm of breathing. And you can see that there are nerves that are leaving the medulla oblongata, its respiratory centers, and it's innervating the muscles that are used for breathing. The pons also has some influence over your breathing because it actually can send signals to the medulla oblongata to modify the medulla oblongata's function based on information from higher brain centers. So your pons has this group of nuclei called the pontine respiratory group, and they can either stimulate or inhibit the medulla oblongata. So what stimuli actually control your respiratory rate? So how does my body know to start speeding up breathing or to slow it down? You might think it's oxygen because you know how vital oxygen is for us, but despite the body's need for oxygen, it's actually the lowering of the pH as the result of the accumulation of carbon dioxide in our blood that drives our need to breathe. So what I mean by that is if you hold your breath, it's not the lack of oxygen that's going to make you all of a sudden gasp for air. It's actually the buildup of carbon dioxide in your body that triggers you to take a breath. And this is why you can't die from actually trying to hold your breath. You pass out first. It is really important to understand the relationship between carbon dioxide and the acidity of your blood. So remember that carbon dioxide always increases the acidity of your bodily fluids. And this is because your blood is mostly water. And when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it quickly forms a molecule called carbonic acid. And something is considered an acid if it releases hydrogen ions into a solution. And carbonic acid quickly will dissociate into a molecule. Dissociate just means falls apart. So it quickly dissociates into a molecule called bicarbonate and releases hydrogen ions. So again, something that is neutral, has a pH of 7, it's considered neutral because it has an equal amount of hydrogen ions as it does hydroxide ions, shown in blue here. However, as the amount of hydrogen ions increases, it becomes more acidic and the pH gets lower. If it becomes more basic, it means that the hydrogen ion concentration is decreasing. So the important relationship to remember is as carbon dioxide levels increase, it increases the amount of hydrogen ions, which increases the acidity, and it lowers the pH. You have certain chemoreceptors in your body that can detect the hydrogen ion levels in your cerebrospinal fluid or your blood, and then it can send that information to the respiratory centers in your brain to tell your brain whether you need to speed up your breathing rate or decrease your breathing rate to help to modify the carbon dioxide levels in your blood. You should know the location of these chemoreceptors. You have what we call the central chemoreceptors because they're located in your central nervous system. And the central chemoreceptors are mainly located in your medulla oblongata, and they sense the hydrogen ion levels, or in other words, the pH of your cerebrospinal fluid. You also have peripheral chemoreceptors, which are located outside of your central nervous system. And these are specifically located in your carotid arteries, which send blood to your head, and also located in your aortic arch. And so these chemoreceptors are actually detecting the hydrogen ion levels or pH in your blood, and then they're sending information to your respiratory centers in your brainstem and telling them whether you need to speed up or slow down your breathing rate. It is extremely important to maintain a normal pH in your blood. And your blood pH is normally 7.4, and the range is between 7.35 and 7.45. So it's a little bit basic. If you fall below 7.35, you start suffering from something called acidosis, where your blood is too acidic. If it goes above 7.45, you start suffering from something called alkalosis. And going above 7.8 would lead to death, and getting below 7 also leads to death. So there's just a very narrow range where your body is happy. And this has a lot to do with the fact that enzymes in your body only work within a specific pH. So if you change that pH at all, your body, like the chemical processes in your body, pretty much just shut down. So respiratory acidosis is when your blood becomes too acidic because the carbon dioxide levels are too high. And when you have too high carbon dioxide levels, we call that hypercapnia. Hyper, again, means like high, and capnia is referring to the carbon dioxide. You can also suffer from the opposite, respiratory alkalosis, and that's when your blood becomes too basic because carbon dioxide levels are too low. And what would cause that would be hypocapnia. Capnia, again, means carbon dioxide. Hypo means too low. Some of the signs of having acidosis or alkalosis could be headache, dizziness, confusion. Having acidosis, it can also lead to feelings of anxiety or feelings of drowsiness. With alkalosis, you may actually feel some pain or numbness in your body as well when that is occurring. So how can your body reverse respiratory acidosis? If your carbon dioxide levels are too high, one thing your body can do is actually increase your breathing rate. If you have really rapid breathing, that would be hyperventilation, when you're breathing out really fast. And hyperventilation allows you to expel carbon dioxide faster than your body can make it. So it's a way to get rid of carbon dioxide. If you're not suffering from respiratory acidosis and you start to hyperventilate, that can also be a problem. This is one of the reasons why they say if someone's suffering from anxiety and they're hyperventilating, they say breathe into a bag. The reason they tell them to do that is because it allows you to keep breathing back in the carbon dioxide you're breathing out. Because if your carbon dioxide levels drop too fast, it can actually cause you to pass out. Okay, so it's trying you breathing into the bag to make sure you don't breathe out too much carbon dioxide. If you're suffering from respiratory alkalosis, this means, again, your blood's too basic. You must have too low carbon dioxide levels. One thing you can do is to slow down your breathing rate. For example, if you hold your breath, you're actually going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in your body, because when you're holding your breath, your body's still producing carbon dioxide waste, but you're not expelling it, right? So you're just building up the amount of carbon dioxide in your body. All right, so let's test your understanding on the stuff we just covered. Where are the peripheral chemoreceptors located? These are located in two places, the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. What stimulus in the blood or cerebrospinal fluid do chemoreceptors directly detect to regulate respiration rates? So what stimulus would it be? The strongest stimulus is the hydrogen ion levels, or the pH. Now, you do have some chemoreceptors for carbon dioxide and oxygen, but they aren't as powerful in influencing respiration rates as your hydrogen ion receptors. As the level of carbon dioxide increases in the blood becomes more acidic, right? Because carbon dioxide mixing with water forms that carbonic acid, which quickly breaks down and releases hydrogen ions. As the level of carbon dioxide increases in the blood, the pH becomes lower. Lower pH means more acidity. Number 4, respiratory alkalosis is caused by, so it's saying when it's the blood becomes basic, that would be caused by not having enough carbon dioxide, so hypocapnia. Number 5, respiratory acidosis is caused by having too much carbon dioxide, hypercapnia. Hyperventilation would result in an decrease or an increase in blood carbon dioxide levels. Well, if you're hyperventilating, you're breathing out, like your breathing rate's really quick. And so what that means is you're breathing out carbon dioxide again faster than your body can make it. So if I'm breathing it out really fast, that would cause my blood carbon dioxide levels to decrease. Hypoventilation, I like to kind of think of the extreme case if I was holding my breath, but it really just means like you're slowing down your breathing rate. But if I was like holding my breath, my carbon dioxide levels would build up in my body, so it would increase my blood carbon dioxide levels. All right, so far what we've talked about are 2 factors that allow you to bring air into your lungs and to exhale air out of your lungs. And again, this is called pulmonary ventilation. And those 2 factors that allow pulmonary ventilation to happen are muscle contractions and relaxation, as well as a pressure difference between the atmospheric pressure and the pressure within your lungs. We also talked about some factors that make it more difficult for you to bring air in or out of your lungs. In addition to that, we just spoke about the location and the role of the brain centers in regulating your respiratory rate, and also what type of stimuli trigger you to increase or decrease your respiratory rate. Now we're going to look at what drives the gas exchange happening within your body. So specifically, we're going to talk about what drives the gas exchange happening actually at the alveoli, from the alveoli into your blood, and then between the blood and the tissues in your body. So alveolar gas exchange is also known as external respiration. It is the exchange of gases that occurs between the air space in the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. So which direction are the gases moving here? Oxygen, which we inhale, then moves from the air space in our alveoli into the blood. Carbon dioxide is a waste product that our body creates. So carbon dioxide will move from our blood into the airspace so that it can be exhaled. When we're talking about systemic gas exchange, this is also known as internal respiration. This is the exchange of gases that occurs between the blood and the tissue cells. And in this case, the goal is to supply our tissue cells with oxygen. So oxygen actually leaves the blood and will enter the tissue cells. And the tissue cells are producing carbon dioxide as a waste product, so the carbon dioxide will leave the tissue cells and move to the blood. But what allows this gas exchange to happen? Well, the diffusion of gases and the direction in which they diffuse is influenced by 2 major factors. The first is the partial pressure gradient of that gas, or in other words, the difference in the concentration of a gas in the 2 different areas. And remember from before that gases always flow from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. A lot of times this word partial pressure scares students, and I don't want you to be scared of this word. You can simply think of partial pressure of a gas as being similar to saying the concentration of that gas. The matter of fact is that the amount of gas in a solution is just expressed as its partial pressure rather than saying its concentration, but they basically mean a very similar thing. All right, so let's apply this concept of partial pressure to alveolar gas exchange. So here's a picture of the alveolus. And notice that within the alveolus, or in other words, the air sacs within our lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeters of mercury, okay, because we're bringing in some fresh air into our lungs here. However, the blood in the pulmonary capillaries only has a partial pressure of oxygen of 40. So which way will oxygen want to move if it's going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure? Well, oxygen is going to go into the blood. So the pulmonary capillaries load up oxygen as they move past the alveoli. Now, if we look at carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is 45, whereas the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air sac is only 40. So if carbon dioxide is going to move down its concentration gradient, it's going to move out of the blood. So the blood unloads carbon dioxide at the alveoli. So let's see what's happening at our systemic gas exchange areas. So remember, systemic gas exchange is between the systemic capillaries and the tissue cells. And the systemic capillaries are pretty saturated with oxygen because this is blood that has come from the lungs, okay? It's already picked up a lot of oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic capillaries is about 104 millimeters of mercury, whereas the partial pressure of oxygen in your tissue cells is only about 40 millimeters of mercury. And that has to do with the fact that your tissue cells are constantly using up oxygen. The process that's happening in all your tissue cells is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration uses up oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. So the partial pressure of oxygen is really low out in the tissue space. So which way will oxygen want to move? Well, down its partial pressure gradient. So it's going to go from 104 to 40. And your blood will unload oxygen at your tissue cells. Which way will carbon dioxide move? Well, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 in the tissue cells, and it is 40 in your systemic capillaries. So it's going to go from 45 to 40, and your blood will load up carbon dioxide at your tissue cells. So it's the partial pressure gradient, or in other words, the difference in the partial pressure that drives which direction oxygen and carbon dioxide will move at both the alveoli and at the tissues within your body. The second factor that greatly influences the diffusion of a gas is that gas's solubility, or in other words, how well does it mix with the blood? Well, carbon dioxide is much more soluble in blood than oxygen is, and that makes it easier for carbon dioxide to diffuse in and out of the blood. So I really want you to remember this. Carbon dioxide is more soluble in blood than oxygen. Now this becomes important because since it's so easy for carbon dioxide to move in and out of the blood, carbon dioxide doesn't need as large of a pressure gradient as oxygen needs to drive its movement. So look here, in order for oxygen to be driven into the blood capillaries, it has a very large gradient. So the difference in the partial pressure is about 60 between the blood and the alveolus. But the difference in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or in other words, its gradient, is only 5. And it doesn't need as big of a difference because it's so soluble, it can easily move back and forth. Okay, and you see the same thing happening at systemic gas exchange. You have a very big gradient of oxygen to drive the movement of oxygen, whereas the carbon dioxide, again, has a very small gradient. It doesn't need a huge partial pressure difference to drive its movement. So this is a great slide that summarizes alveolar and systemic gas exchange. And so if you look at the top here, this is the alveoli, and this is showing the pulmonary capillaries and then the systemic capillaries, because this is a circuit in your body. The left figure is showing oxygen diffusion, and the right figure is showing carbon dioxide diffusion. And we can see that let's focus on oxygen diffusion again. In the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is around 100. However, the blood approaching the alveoli in the pulmonary capillaries has very little oxygen. It's oxygen poor blood that's approaching your lungs. So its partial pressure is about 40. So which way is oxygen going to want to move? Well, oxygen is going to want to move from the alveoli into the blood. And it's going to move into the blood until the partial pressure in the blood matches the partial pressure outside. So that's how the blood becomes oxygenated. And then that oxygenated blood will make its way to our systemic capillaries. And when it gets here, it's going to be unloaded into our tissues because the partial pressure of oxygen in our tissues is extremely low. And so all the oxygen leaves our blood, and now we have oxygen poor blood, and it's returning to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. And it just goes around like that. If we look at what's happening with carbon dioxide levels that are approaching in the blood, approaching our alveoli is high. And so when it gets to our lungs, the carbon dioxide moves down its partial pressure gradient into the alveoli. And now the carbon dioxide level in our blood is lower, and that lower carbon dioxide blood is going to make its way to their systemic capillaries, where it's going to pick up more carbon dioxide. And then it's going to go to our lungs, unload the carbon dioxide. And then it's going to go to the systemic capillaries, pick up more carbon dioxide, and it just keeps going. But it's, again, that partial pressure gradient that's driving that movement. One thing that I want to point out is how the composition of the air that you're breathing in, or the inspired air, is different from the composition of the alveolar air, or the air, again, in your air sacs. And one of the major differences is that the alveolar air has less oxygen and more carbon dioxide than the inspired air. And you can see that here. There's less oxygen in the alveoli, and there's more carbon dioxide in the alveoli than out here. And this has to do with the fact that the oxygen-rich air that you're breathing in is actually mixing with carbon dioxide-rich residual air that's still in your lungs. So remember, there's always air still left in your lungs every time you exhale. You're never breathing out all of that air. So some of that oxygen-rich air you're breathing in is mixing with that carbon dioxide-rich air that's still kind of sitting there in your lungs. The other thing that you might notice here is that the alveolar air has more water vapor than the inspired air. And this has to do with the fact that the air is being humidified as it enters your respiratory system, and it comes in contact with the mucous membranes. And you can see that here. The alveolar air has more water than the inspired air. So we've talked about the factors that influence the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the blood. And now let's look at how oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually transported in the blood. This is going to be really important because oxygen and carbon dioxide must be carried in the blood from the pulmonary capillaries to the systemic capillaries and then back again. And oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be carried a little bit differently because of the fact that I mentioned just previously that carbon dioxide is a lot more soluble in blood than oxygen is. Since oxygen is not very soluble in blood, only about 1.5% of your oxygen is actually just dissolved in the plasma of the blood. The rest of oxygen, 98.5% of it, has to be attached to a carrier molecule, which we call hemoglobin. And if you remember, hemoglobin is found within your red blood cells. Hemoglobin has 4 binding sites on it. These are called heme groups that oxygen can bind to. And anytime a hemoglobin molecule has one or more oxygen molecules bound to it, we call it oxyhemoglobin. And it would be 100% saturated if it had 4 oxygen molecules attached to it, 1 to each of the 4 heme groups. The binding of the first oxygen molecule to one of these heme groups actually promotes binding of other oxygen molecules, and that has to do with some slight molecular changes that occur. If there's no oxygen bound to the hemoglobin at all, then we would call it deoxyhemoglobin. Another thing I want to point out is that the unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin is going to be greater, happen at a quicker rate if the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is lower. And this occurs because if the partial pressure of oxygen in your tissues is lower, it's going to increase the partial pressure gradient between the blood and the tissues. So there's going to be a greater difference in the partial pressures of the two. And the greater the difference is in partial pressures, the faster diffusion occurs. And this makes sense. So imagine if your skeletal muscle cells, imagine your muscle cells are using up a whole bunch of oxygen. So they're going to have very little oxygen in them. The partial pressure will be really low in those tissue cells. And so oxygen is going to diffuse really quickly from your blood into those muscle cells. Carbon dioxide, however, is going to be transported in a very different way than oxygen. Carbon dioxide is very soluble in blood, and it can react a lot with water. So 90% of your carbon dioxide that enters your blood is actually transported as a molecule called bicarbonate. And this occurs because when carbon dioxide interacts with the water in your blood, it quickly forms something called carbonic acid. And this carbonic acid will rapidly dissociate, or in other words, break down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So most of the carbon dioxide that enters your blood gets turned into bicarbonate ions, and that's how it's transported. There is a little bit of carbon dioxide that's bound to proteins such as hemoglobin. However, if hemoglobin has the choice to choose between oxygen or carbon dioxide, it's going to bind stronger to oxygen and choose oxygen over carbon dioxide to carry. And hemoglobin can transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide simultaneously, but each gas kind of somewhat inhibits the transport of the other. So it can get kind of confusing with that. But just what I want you to remember is that, yeah, carbon dioxide can bind to hemoglobin, but hemoglobin has a much stronger affinity or attraction for oxygen than carbon dioxide. And then there is a little bit of carbon dioxide that's dissolved as a gas in the plasma, and you could think of this as similar to a carbonated soft drink. Soft drinks are made carbonated because you add carbon dioxide to them. So it's kind of similar in your blood. There is a little bit of like carbon dioxide bubbliness happening inside of your blood too. But it's only a small amount of carbon dioxide, 5% of it, that's actually like as little bubbles inside your blood. So let's look at what causes carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, many of you should have heard of carbon monoxide poisoning because it's something that you have to watch out for. This occurs when there's too much carbon monoxide in the air and it enters your bloodstream, replacing the oxygen in your red blood cells. Every house should have a functioning carbon monoxide alarm because carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas that you will not be able to detect until you start feeling the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is made from cigarette smoke. It's also found in engine exhaust and the fumes from furnaces and heaters. And a lot of times your furnace might be leaking carbon monoxide and you won't even know it until you're passed out or feeling really dizzy. Why does this happen? This occurs because carbon monoxide binds much stronger to hemoglobin than oxygen. So if hemoglobin had the choice between carbon dioxide and oxygen, it's going to choose oxygen. But if it has the choice between carbon monoxide and oxygen, it's going to grab onto that carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide binds 210 times stronger to hemoglobin than oxygen does. So once carbon monoxide is bound to the hemoglobin, oxygen has no chance. And so this becomes really deadly because carbon monoxide will start entering your blood, binding to your hemoglobin, and then you can't transport oxygen. And next thing you know, you're feeling dizzy and you pass out, and that will lead to death unless somebody can remove you from that environment where there's carbon monoxide. Some other little side facts about carbon monoxide poisoning and just carbon monoxide in general in your blood. In non-smokers, less than 1.5% of our hemoglobin is occupied by carbon monoxide, but this can be up to 3% of your hemoglobin in polluted areas because polluted air has a lot more carbon monoxide in it. If we're talking about smokers, though, smokers typically will have about 10% of their hemoglobin occupied by carbon monoxide, and this helps to explain why it's a lot harder for somebody who's smoking to get sufficient amount of oxygen into their body because a lot of their hemoglobin is actually occupied by carbon monoxide and it's blocking oxygen. Concentrations of just 0.1% carbon monoxide in the air is enough to bind to 50% of a person's hemoglobin, and then 0.2% carbon monoxide levels in the air become quickly lethal. So what do you do if you do get carbon monoxide poisoning? How can it be treated? Usually this can be treated by increasing the atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen. So you increase the amount of oxygen in the air. And one way to do that is to put somebody in a hyperbaric chamber. In these chambers, it's pretty much like pure oxygen that they're breathing in. So now you're increasing the partial pressure gradient of oxygen between the air and your blood. So the oxygen is kind of forced into your blood, and it helps that oxygen actually replace carbon monoxide. And so the person would stay in those chambers until the carbon monoxide has been replaced by the oxygen. Now let's look at the effect of high altitude on partial pressure gradient. So remember, it's the partial pressure gradient of oxygen in the air that you're breathing in and the partial pressure of oxygen in your blood that drives oxygen to enter your blood. Okay, so having a larger gradient is good because it's going to increase the diffusion rate of oxygen into your blood. However, high altitudes can affect this partial pressure gradient. In order to understand this, you have to understand how partial pressure is calculated in a gas mixture. And this is something you want to understand for the exam. So first thing that you have to realize is that gases are usually a mixture of several different gas molecules. For example, the atmosphere consists of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and some other gaseous molecules as well. So each one of these gases contributes a little bit to the total pressure of the air that's around us. So the partial pressure of a gas, or so for example, the partial pressure of oxygen, is the amount that gas contributes to the total pressure of the gas mixture. So each gas in a mixture, again, will have its own little partial pressure. So here's gas A, gas B, and gas C. Each one has its own partial pressure. You mix them all three of them together, and the total pressure of this gas is the sum of each of the partial pressures of each one individually. So the total pressure of a mixture of gases is the sum of all the individual partial pressures of each gas. So let's apply this. The way that you can calculate partial pressure is using something called Dalton's law. It states that a specific gas type in a mixture exerts its own pressure. Thus, the total pressure of a gas mixture equals the sum of the partial pressures of each individual gas. So the easiest way to understand this is to actually do some calculations. Surprisingly, doing a little bit of math will actually make this seem like it makes more sense. So let's think about it. The air around you is 78.6% nitrogen, 20.9% oxygen, 0.04% carbon dioxide, 0.5% water vapor, and then there's some other minor gases. At sea level, the total atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. So how can we calculate the partial pressure of each of these gases above? All you have to do is take the percent of that gas and multiply it by the total pressure present. Okay, but in order to do that, you always have to just move the decimal place over twice. Okay, so what's 78.6% of 760? I just moved the decimal place over twice. So I do 0.786 times 760, and I get 597 millimeters of mercury. So that's the partial pressure of nitrogen. That's how much pressure nitrogen is contributing to this 760 millimeters of mercury. What is the partial pressure of oxygen? Do the same thing again. So I just take this 20.9%, I move the decimal place over twice to get 0.209, multiply that by 760, the total pressure, and the partial pressure of oxygen is 159 millimeters of mercury. So oxygen is contributing 159 millimeters of mercury of pressure to the atmospheric pressure. What about the partial pressure of water? Well, now I'm going to take this number here, 0.5%, move the decimal place over twice, 1, 2, and then multiply that by 760, and you get 3.8. Okay, if you haven't, pause the video and try to figure out what it is for carbon dioxide. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air around you, you just move the decimal place over twice. So it was originally right here. So 1, 2, multiply that by 760. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air around me is 0.3 millimeters of mercury. Now this is going to be important again in understanding how altitude affects partial pressure gradients. So how does altitude affect the partial pressure of oxygen? Well, let's use Kilimanjaro as an example. 2 summers ago, my husband and I actually climbed Kilimanjaro. And Kilimanjaro is the tallest mountain in Africa, and it's also a dormant volcano. Its height is about 5,800 meters, and the atmospheric pressure at that elevation is about 379 millimeters of mercury. So compare that to sea level, where it's 760. On top of Kilimanjaro, it's 379. Now, how does this affect the partial pressure of oxygen? Well, one thing you'll notice is that the composition of air hasn't changed from up on the top of the mountain versus at sea level. So the air is still made up of 20.9% oxygen. That hasn't changed. But how do we calculate the partial pressure of oxygen again? All you do is you take 20.9% and multiply it by 760. In order to do that again, you have to move the decimal place over to the left twice. And so take 0.209 times 760, the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level is 159. However, let's do the same thing for the top of Kilimanjaro up here. So we take 0.209, but now the total pressure is only 379. So 20.9% of 379 would be 79 millimeters of mercury. What this means is that there's about 50% less oxygen available on top of Kilimanjaro than at sea level. And that's greatly going to affect how quickly oxygen can diffuse into your pulmonary capillaries, because now the partial pressure gradient is a lot less. And having less oxygen available to breathe can have huge impacts on your body, and especially how much oxygen, again, can get into your blood. Every morning and night when we climb the mountain, I think we did it in like 7 or 8 days. I can't quite remember anymore. But every morning and night, we actually had our oxygen saturation levels checked. And that is actually what you can see in this row right here. I actually graphed it out because I was kind of curious how it was affecting my body. So this is showing the elevation in blue, shown by this axis here. And this is showing the change in my oxygen saturation level in my blood by this orange line here. So in town, the oxygen saturation in my blood was 100%. Like I was I think I was at like 99% when we were in town. But as we started climbing the mountain, you can see what's happening to the level of oxygen in my blood is going down to where it's dropping in like 80% or so. And sometimes it would pop back up. But when we got near the top of the mountain, it was down to around like 79% oxygen saturation in my blood. And trust me, I was feeling the altitude sickness from that. So why again does this happen? Why was it so hard for oxygen to get into my blood? Well, this has to do with the fact that at higher altitudes, the partial pressure gradient of oxygen between the air and the blood is less than at sea level. Therefore, oxygen is going to diffuse slower into the blood than at sea level. And you can see that in the graph here. So this was the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level was 159, right? And then the partial pressure of oxygen in your blood, if you remember in the pulmonary capillaries, was about 40. So look how big this gradient is. The steeper the gradient, the faster oxygen diffuses into the blood. But on top of Kilimanjaro, the partial pressure of oxygen was only 79 versus in our blood, which is 40. So now what's that difference there? That's a difference of about 39. And that smaller gradient or difference causes the oxygen to diffuse really slowly into my blood. And that's why you saw as I was climbing, less and less oxygen was actually in my blood from that. The effects of having less oxygen in your blood due to climbing altitude like that can lead to what's called altitude sickness, where you start feeling headaches, you start feeling dizziness, a loss of appetite, very nauseous, and just a lot of fatigue. And trust me, I felt every single one of those side effects when I was climbing Kilimanjaro. There were multiple times where I was like, I just don't think I can do this. But we made it. I made it to the top. It was not easy for me. I just definitely think the altitude is what got to me the most. And I have two little videos to show you that kind of just show you the effect of climbing up here. The first video that I'm going to show you is just demonstrating how cold it was on top of Kilimanjaro. Not only was I not able to breathe, it was coldest I've ever been in my life, where your water bottle would just freeze as you're walking up the mountain. As you can see, my water's already starting to freeze, and our camelbacks are already frozen.
I'm gonna blow into my nostril.
It's like all ice in there. Pretty cool. And then the next clip, we haven't even made it to the top of Kilimanjaro yet. We've just made it to the edge of the crater. We still have, once we made it to this point, we still had another 3-hour walk to get to the highest point. We had to walk along the crater. But at this point, I really could not breathe, and I was so cold. And you can just kind of hear a little bit of how delirious I'm feeling at this point.
It was worth it.
Oh my goodness. I almost died. That was really, really hard. We are at Gilman's Point. It's hard to read the sign. Behind me is just, so that, is that a crater?
I think this is a glacier.
Oh, it's a glacier? Behind me is a glacier. If I do another 360, you can see the sun is rising. And then there's Eddie. Eddie, how do you feel?
Great now. It was tough, but
that was really tough.
it was worth it.
But yeah, the view up here is beautiful. Also, Udio and Peter brought us hot tea up here. It's amazing because it's freezing. Do you know what the temperature is up here? There's tea. It's ours. There you go. Udio, do you know what the temperature is?
Not really.
Not really. Very, very cold. Hopefully from that video you could see a little bit of how kind of exhausted I was. I was trying to put on a strong face, but I really felt like I had zero energy and I could not breathe like at all when I was up there. I didn't know how I was going to go another 3 hours to make it to the top. When we had left, like before that video, we had left at midnight, I think it was, to climb up to that point. So we had already been hiking 6 hours to get to that point. And then we had 3 more hours to go to get to the top. And then we were going to make our way down again. But if any of you are interested in climbing Kilimanjaro, you can ask me any questions you want about that, and I'll tell you all about preparing for that. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about is deep sea diving and decompression sickness. Now, before I talk about decompression sickness, I just want you to think about what happens when you dive deeper to the pressure around you? Well, you can imagine this as when you dive into a pool, right? When you dive deep into a pool, you start feeling more pressure on your body. And so this happens too when you're diving really deep in the ocean. Now, decompression sickness or the bends is a disorder that results not from the actual diving down part. Okay, so when you dive down really deep, that doesn't cause decompression sickness. What causes decompression sickness is ascending too quickly. Now, why does this occur? Before I kind of go into the definition of decompression sickness, let's talk about what's happening here. So, when somebody's diving really deep, they're actually breathing in compressed air. Okay, so highly pressurized air through a tank. This air consists of 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen. This is similar to the atmospheric composition of air. Oxygen must be diluted, though. You can't just breathe in pure oxygen for a very long time, because breathing in pure oxygen can actually lead to nervous tissue damage or something called oxygen toxicity. So it needs to be mixed with another gas, and it's mixed with nitrogen, similar again to the composition of the air around us. Well, nitrogen normally dissolves poorly in your blood, but because this person's breathing in really compressed air or highly pressurized air, and they're in a very pressurized environment when they're going really deep, that nitrogen will easily dissolve in their blood. And so their blood has a lot of dissolved nitrogen in it as they dive really deep. Now, the problem arises whenever you start rising too quickly, because imagine it, you're diving really deep, nitrogen's getting dissolved in your blood. So imagine these tiny little nitrogen bubbles in your blood. If you rise too quickly, these tiny nitrogen gas bubbles will start to expand because the pressure is getting less as you go up. So as you go up, there's less pressure, so the nitrogen bubbles aren't as compressed and they start to actually get bigger. And this creates large nitrogen bubbles, and these bubbles can actually form in your muscles, your joints, and your capillaries, and this can cause a lot of pain. So this causes a lot of pain in your joints, and it causes people to bend over in pain, and that's why it's called the bends, because of these nitrogen bubbles actually that form in the muscles and joints. So how can you prevent decompression sickness? How can you prevent these nitrogen bubbles from forming in your joints and so forth? The best way to prevent that is actually rising very slowly from a deep dive. And this allows the pressure to decrease slowly as you rise. And since you're allowing the pressure to decrease slowly, that nitrogen that has dissolved in your blood, you can kind of slowly breathe it out versus it expanding within your body. And so if you give enough time to breathe out all the nitrogen, by the time you make it to the top, you don't get those nitrogen bubbles. Here's actually a picture of somebody who's suffering from decompression sickness. And here you can see a joint here that has a whole bunch of gas in it. And this is a nitrogen bubble that has formed in their joint, and it's causing like severe pain. All right, so that is the end of the respiratory system chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything that you would like me to explain in more detail. You can either comment below, you can send me an email, or you can ask me in class.
Mhm.